Join us today, we have Charisse Lakeside. Charisse is a senior spec writer at RDH Building Science, a former president of CSI's Portland chapter, and a proud CSI fellow. Charisse is particularly passionate about young professional development, public speaking, and improving project coordination and communication. I've also included Charisse's Twitter handle below, as well as the hashtag CSI Kraken. Charisse, can you speak to that a little bit for us and tell us the history behind that one?
Oh, thanks for warning me about that question. I'm a fairly a newcomer to CSI compared to a lot of the people in there. And when I first joined, I was approached to join the board for the Portland chapter, which I thought was kind of crazy because I was a new member. And there was a discussion at one of our board meetings that was maybe going on a really long time. And I'm not super patient and I like to get things done. So I very nicely said, how about we do this? And threw out some options to a number of people and said, everybody does a little bit, we get it done, bam. And the current president at that time muttered under his breath, oh my God, release the Kraken. Because it was like my first board meeting. And I don't know, it's stuck and it's kind of become a movement. And other chapters have Kraken and they have Kraken awards and we have Kraken bottle openers and stickers and it kind of a positive movement for moving forward in the industry and change and doing it collaboratively. So that's the story. It's not a negative thing, it's a good thing, hopefully.
That's fantastic. Also joining us today is Matt Johnson. Matt is a senior product manager at BSU SpecLink. Matt has spent the past 30 years in product management with a focus on products built in support of construction specifications. And now for the webinar, I'd like to turn things over to Matt. Matt?
All right, Sarah, appreciate it. So going to show you how we've kind of broken up our presentation today. We've put it into 3 distinct parts, going to cover a lot of territory, and we'll try to be relatively quick here. We're going to be starting with a short overview of the spec writing process, pointing out the specific places that your firm can traditionally provide influence and giving some perspective on both ROI and especially timelines, which is really going to be our focus today, for getting your product or products through that adoption curve faster. And we'll also be providing a snapshot of the tools available to you, including those that will allow your firm to measure success. After that foundational piece, we wanted to step through 11 common issues that will slow adoption. Some of these are fairly general and apply to a lot of building product manufacturers, but we'll also get specific and identify some common scenarios, challenges that BPMs face, and what we see as a sound strategy to address these. Paying particular attention to the fact that the answers may be different depending on how, on your product and how critical a potential failure of a new product might be perceived, how unique it is, and where it currently sits on the product adoption curve. Charisse's request, we're leaving a significant amount of time open for questions. So we'd encourage you to go ahead and submit those through the chat. And a word as to format, one of my least favorite webinar formats is to have someone read slides to me. So Charisse and I were planning to make this more conversational, and with her background, she'll be taking the lead on a good deal of the presentation and adding some depth and context to some of the content that I'll be walking us through. So the new product adoption curve. In general terms, this graphic, I think, probably applies to most industries. You've got your innovators and early adopters. You can see the chasm. That's where firms often struggle to break through from that initial success of working with firms willing to take some risk in order to be forward-thinking and progressive in their design work, and moving to the early majority. It's a far more sizable group that will be just as likely to perceive themselves as willing to take some risks, and incorporating newer products and technologies into their projects, but they might have a much higher threshold for their evaluation of liability and risk. And then there's, of course, the late majority and the laggards. Now, this is a group that still bears mention, since a lot of the building product manufacturers that we work with are already firmly established, and a lot of what they're looking to do is simply to increase spec share. And A lot of time that's where it's coming from. So maybe you have a product that isn't established already in that early majority. You know, maybe you have an innovative product closer to the beginning, and one of your problems is it doesn't fit nicely into a pre-existing product category or even a CSI master format section. There's some pathways out there that you'll see some established building product manufacturers taking that are going to be largely ineffective for your situation. And when it comes to shortening that timeline on the adoption curve, applying a mature product strategy to just, you know, to one that's just starting out can contribute to a lot of the delays that we see people trying to overcome. Therese, let me ask you, we've actually talked about kind of where you might see yourself. I mean, if you had to self-identify where you sit, innovator, early adopter, early majority, how would you describe yourself? And is it really the same for all products, that description?
Yeah, I don't know how many times I'm going to say, well, it depends in this presentation, because it does depend. I think the three things that will determine where I'm going to be on the scale or where my firm is going to be on the scale is going to be, what is the product, who is the manufacturer, and what is my relationship with their rep. So if it's a product, I'm now working in building science. So the building enclosure is not a place you want to make a mistake. And it's not something that's an area that we're probably going to be more likely to take a risk on a new product that doesn't have some good testing and history behind it. But if it's something like carpet, I think we were using in our conversation just because it's easy. And it's a newfangled type of carpet, and you know, that's something where you're taking a lot lower cost and construction risk on trying it new. So where we're going to come in here, you know, is really going to depend on what that product is. Is the manufacturer super known to us and has a really great reputation for all of their products? That's probably going to factor into where we try their product earlier or later. And then, do I even know the rep? You know, I have reps, they're basically all of my CSI reps, that I trust, and I know that they're gonna give it to me straight, and they're gonna tell me, trust me, you don't want to use my product here if it's not the place. And so if I already know the rep and I know I can have a real conversation and get a real answer, not a sales or marketing answer, and get my job done, then we might be more willing to step out of the box a little bit and try something that's new in that case. So those are probably the three big things that determine I could fall at any place on this scale.
You know, that's it depends. I hear that all the time. It's one of the things that makes it tough to say, in this situation, this is what you should do. There's obviously a lot of different ways to skin the cat out there. It's one of the reasons why we're going to start off with a little bit of an overall explanation of the commercial construction cycle and kind of lay that foundation. And then when we step through very quickly a lot of the common issues that affect the speed at which a product is taken up by the industry, it'll make a little bit more sense. So this first slide here, Therese, you want to go ahead and kind of give your take on breaking down design, bid, build with regards to product selection?
Well, you know, and Matt and I've met a couple times and talked through a number of things, and understanding that we will likely have people on this webinar at all different experience levels. Understanding when and why we're choosing products at particular phases is really important, because just like construction costs, the later you get in construction and making a change, the more that change costs. It's no different on product selection. And what most or a lot of manufacturers or reps don't understand is that our design contracts are front-loaded. So all of our time and money is coming in during the design phase. And so we have a lot less leeway in time to evaluate products in, say, the bid phase with substitutions, or in the construction phase with substitutions if they're allowed. So I guess my bottom line here, to keep it concise, because we'll have plenty of time for questions, is the earlier you get to me And honestly, in my opinion, if you can get to me before you even get to me, and we'll explain that later, the better chance you have, if it's not something we already have in our documents, for us to have the time to look at that and evaluate it and ask the questions we need to ask to see if it's what we need or something we can use. The later you go, the less likely we are to even look at it. And some specifiers won't admit that. But I know some firms during the bid phase categorically will deny all the substitution requests. I don't do that. But it also depends on where we're at on our budget and how, if that project has gone smoothly or it's been insane. And in my specs, I will tell you, we don't allow substitutions during construction except for a couple of extenuating circumstances. So that's the worst time to be trying to get your product into a project, is during construction. Not to say it never happens, of course it does, but that is the absolute worst time.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. You know, adding to this confusing picture and trying to get an idea of when the best time to get your product specified is there's more than one provider out there. There's a dizzying array of providers that do a lot of different things that kind of support that spec process. And you know, we've laid out on the slide here just to help kind of keep things straight in everybody's head. The main reason we've kind of laid these out is to point out a couple really key ones. You know, Master Guide Specifications. There's a number of them out there. There's some free BPM supported ones, but for the most part, most of the ones being used by the industry are either put out by BSD or Deltek's Vitru's product Master Spec. There's a lot of tools to edit those specs, and you know, BSD has a couple of those. Deltek has a couple platforms that they use. An awful lot of specs, as you know, are actually still done in Word, and that's key. As you're going through and evaluating, how can I influence and affect the spec process, understanding the platform that it's done within, and whether the provider of that platform has the ability to sort of steer people in a particular direction or update that platform, really makes a big difference in how effective these different things are. There's a lot of different places to advertise, and I put in RCAT and 4 specs to kind of draw the differentiation and show that they don't provide editing tools, they're not providing guide specs and so forth, but they do serve a role for certain types of things out there. And then tools to measure, very important. Everybody's familiar with Dodge and Construct Connect, but we actually provide a tool that lets you see whether or not you're actually being effective in how you're kind of working through increasing your spec share there. So we were actually going to take you through a fictional, you know, kind of a widget, as it were, of a single product, and kind of show you the different stages of that product getting specified. So the first step here actually begins before the design firm gets involved. All those design firms, they use a master guide specification. Again, that's usually going to come from BSD, or it's going to come from Deltek. And they're going to use that as a starting point to inform their office masters. They're generally not written from scratch. And you know, more importantly, the hundreds of CSI master format sections that make up those 2 respective libraries, they both provide you know, somewhere between 2 and 5 pre-listed you know, building product manufacturers and sometimes products that are listed in there, and they tend to be listed, you know, we've got something that's kind of representative of what all the information about a single type of product might be on the stage. What you see there in green is the 3 products that are part of that guide specification that you really only need to talk to one provider to go through and make sure that you're included in there. And then in turn, that gets passed out. It gets pushed to a lot of different design firms, and it may go into, respectively, several hundred different office masters. So it gets distributed, and this is another really key point, it gets distributed either through a Word document that gets you know, sent out on a regular or quarterly basis, or it gets pushed through an automatic update process. And this is a really critical piece to understand. How those updates from the Master Guide specification actually make it into the office masters of all the respective users of those services is probably going to be one of the biggest factors in the timeline. And I feel fairly confident that this is something the overwhelming majority, like 95% of building product manufacturers, don't really understand. And it can be one of the reasons that they question why it takes so long to affect the process here. So once that office master has, that information has gone into that office master, and you've got those 3 building product manufacturers that they start with, these firms can choose to edit that list, and they often do. They may add an additional provider. They may remove some of the content about that generic product type and add some of their own. If they've had a bad experience, we see this a lot with a product, they may choose to take them out of that office master. And by extension, every project that's created based on that master is now missing that particular product, kind of going forward. And that office master, it's critical to the design firm. It's their corporate memory. They invest a lot of time into it, and they're not going to abandon it or override it. And it's not unusual for a company to not just have one office master, and sometimes that can lead to some confusion. They talk to an architect and think that they're on the same page, and a job comes out and it's not part of it. So, Charisse, I know that some of the firms you've worked with, you guys maintained more than one office master. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have. And so in the interest of full disclosure, obviously I was invited to participate on this discussion because I happen to use SpecLink. I have also used master format in my career, and I have used word specs. I'd rather jump off a bridge than use a word spec, just so make that crystal clear. I'm as honest as I get. I've used SpecLink for about the last 10 years. In my firm right now, I have multiple office masters because we have offices in both the United States and Canada. And in Canada, you have to spell everything different, measure everything different. So I have Canadian masters and I have US masters. One of the things SpecLink just released in December were out of the box Canadian masters, which I about jumped up and down and had a party about, because I thought I was going to have to do word masters in Canada, and I truly don't want to work doing this for a living if I have to work in Word. But I mean, you're right. One of the beautiful things about using a Master Guide Spec is all of that information is already there. Hopefully, you're already there. And in SpecLink, because it's a database-driven program and not a Word-based program, if I don't need your product on a particular project, I just turn it off. It never goes anywhere. In Word documents, you delete all this stuff, and if you make a change halfway through your project, you have to go find it and put it all back in, and it's very inefficient and time-consuming and rift with risk because you may miss things. And so our master is, I'm rebuilding I've only been at this firm a little while, but I'm building new masters here. But I start with the Master Guide Spec. So if you're there, you stay there. If I don't need you, I turn it off. And if I do need you, I just click a button and turn it on. And it's that easy for me to be using you, which is why, for me, I need you in those Master Guide Specs. Then what we do is we take that Master Guide Spec and we modify it for things that are very specific to our project types or things we know we need or contractual requirements. And that Office Master is what we use for our projects. But that Master Guide Spec information is all in there, and the updates are automatically pushed to that. And I just quickly click through a list and accept all the updates that I want to update. And it's incredibly efficient. Why, when I mentioned earlier that you getting in my spec before I even know you exist is the best first line of defense to have a bigger opportunity of being used. Not to say I can't add you to my Office Master, but that stuff will typically not be programmed for the automatic updates and as smart, even though I know how to do most of the programming, it's not going to be as smart as if you're just already there for me to click a button and use you. And I don't think most reps really understand how that functionality works. And I don't have anything against Master Spec. I prefer SpecLink for all of those kinds of efficiencies and how easy it is for me to get things done quickly because I need to work that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every program has their strengths and weaknesses, and I tell you, you should be listed in both. You have a much better chance of getting used before maybe you've even ever talked to me, because I might have already gone to your website and done research. So
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. And actually, I advise the same thing: get listed in both. The update process and the timeline, it just depends on how long you have to see results. And we'll be coming back to that update process just a little bit here. I wanted to step through the next couple of these relatively quickly, because the core of our presentation is really identifying those 11 things that you can do to kind of reduce the timeline moving along that adoption curve. So, you know, after that office master goes out, it obviously goes into the design phase. And in our sort of example here, those 600 office masters over a few years may spawn 20,000 projects. And in this case, there's still going to be significant editing. This is a lot of the time where a product rep may go in and talk to an individual architect or engineer, you know, somebody that's writing those specs up, and they may go through and make some changes. Maybe they add your product right there. And you can see if we've kind of gone from 4 to 5, but it doesn't move backwards in a lot of cases. It doesn't become part of that office master. You know, and when you get into the project bid phase, there's some restrictions on making changes. They have to be done in a very specific way. And Sharice is probably best to explain that.
Well, so in the bid phase is when we're getting substitutions from manufacturers. And we're back to what I mentioned before. We have very little time allowed in our contract now to research new products or to research products that we know about to see if they are equivalent to what we already have. And if we're out of time, and we already have things that we feel pretty confident in, we just can't do it. And during construction, substitutions are submitted by the GC, and my specs say you can't submit any substitutions except for a couple of key reasons. So like the product's been discontinued. Obviously, we need to look at an alternate product if the product's been discontinued, or the plant burned down and the lead time is now 6 months, not 2 weeks. Obviously, that is an extenuating circumstance and we need to look at using something else. But that construction phase both the bid and construction phase, we don't have the amount left in our contract at that time to do exhaustive reviews of new products or alternate products. And that's why, and I hear it from reps all the time, you know, my substitutions never get accepted. I get it, and I understand the frustration, but if you understand that that's the worst time to be approaching us about getting into a project, then maybe just changing our interaction a little bit so you can talk to us when we have time to look at it. Then there would be more success there, or just have it in the master spec so when you call me about it during the design phase, it's already there, and after we talk about it, I can just go click a few buttons, turn it on, and now I can use it.
There you go. You know, there's certainly a role for talking to the GC and having reps working individually with the specifiers, but take care of the easier stuff first. You know, you can see here every change that goes in is a request from through a GC isn't making it back upstream. So the next time a project comes out, it's probably not going to be part of that office master. And you know, hopefully this helps bring a little bit of clarity to that overall process. And it should make things a little bit easier as we go through the main part of our presentation, which is identifying common issues that will slow adoption. So we're going to deal with these pretty rapid fire and kind of tag team a lot of these. The first one we're going to throw open here is it's kind of what we just talked about here. If you're focusing on that general contractor, the GC, before you leverage the beginning of the workflow and you think you're being effective, that's probably one of the biggest things that you can do to really delay the process. There's nothing wrong with doing it. It obviously has its role, but just make sure you're in that master guide specification first. And those guide specs, you know, a few years back, we did an analysis of where a lot of that content originated from. And what we found is the most commonly used sections. This is taking a look at like 16,000 projects. Most commonly used section, the source is overwhelmingly BSD and master spec. One of the reasons why you probably want to get listed in both. And they both provide the ability to do proprietary specs as well that fit within their library. And generally, they're going to be the first place the respective user bases are going to look. Now, at the edges, what that analysis saw is that the edges, if you're doing something really unusual, like windmills or solar roof tiles or something like this, then those third-party directory sites actually put up some pretty good numbers if it wasn't part of kind of that basic library that you would typically get from BSD or Deltek. But just make sure that you're dealing with the master guide specification first. So second item here, and this is the one that I referred to a little bit earlier, and the one that I feel very confident is going to be a surprise to a lot of people. It's the timeline. It's the delay between getting in that master guide spec and when it actually shows up in that office master can surprise a lot of people. Now, I've only had this happen once, but years ago I had a building product manufacturer get listed, and they were expecting to see a change in the number of products ordered the very next month. This is somebody who's obviously fairly new to the process and didn't understand that there's a time lag that I think everybody on the call does understand. It goes into an office master, becomes a project, and it takes a little while before that actually gets to the bid stage. The delay that I'm referring to is not that delay, what it normally takes to put a project through. It's the delay with how those office masters receive the new products and building product manufacturers from the companies that provide the guide specs. And this is really where we can help. If your timeline to see some results is within 6 months to a year, I'm really not going to try too hard to be agnostic on this specific one. This is one of the main reasons we have so many large AEC firms coming to us. They're managing all those different office masters. It's just a huge problem. Put yourself in the shoes of an AEC design firm. If your updated master guide content comes via a brand new MS Word section, and you're editing in Word, your updates, the process of merging those two groups of content, it's entirely manual, and it's something that doesn't happen very often. If you've just been added in that master guide specification content, it's going to take a little while until they have the time to take that office master that has the big investment time, it has their corporate knowledge and so forth in there, before they can weave that new content in with the old edited stuff. And this is one of the things I really love about SpecLink, is that the updates get pushed to the clients and they just click through and review and accept them. It's our ability to piggyback. I mean, most of what they're concerned about, to be honest, is going to be the content updates. But it's our ability to piggyback on that very same process and push out the new products and so forth that we are doing on behalf of the building product manufacturers that we work with, allows us to really cut that timeline down so that you're seeing something very, very fast, as opposed to waiting for that human process to sort of organically solve itself. So, Charisse, I've seen the process on both sides. You mentioned the updates a little bit earlier. I mean, what's the difference from your perspective? You said you've done content updates via master spec. You've done them coming through BSD's content. I mean, is there any sort of comparison, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to speak to master spec because it's been over 10 years since I've even touched it, so I don't know what that interface looks like anymore. But in SpecLink, if it's something coming from a manufacturer where they've given us a Word spec and we've built our own section out of it because it's not already in our masters or in the SpecLink master, then that takes a lot of time. And that could take me months to build into my office master. If it's an update that's being pushed through SpecLink, I will update my office master fairly regularly, but I think it's really important for reps to understand that when those updates come through SpecLink, my office master will get updated fairly promptly. But if I have 12 projects I've already started and made major edits to for that project, I'm likely not going to push those changes to those projects that are already started. It's going to be for every project going forward. So there's some lag there. And one comment you made earlier that I wanted to clarify a little bit, you mentioned that when we're working on project specs, often those changes don't make it back to the office master. That's not necessarily true. I have a system because I have to work for all of our teams, and I'm the only one for our company that is writing the specs. I have a system for the design teams a way for them to let me know this is something we really need in the master. Now, it may not happen immediately because that takes time. But I personally do get those things we really use a lot, or this has changed for this product, yeah, or that has changed. And I have a place that I keep those, and I block out time to update my office master. But that's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. But if we don't have those products already built into our master, then we have to do that. So it does happen. And there are plenty of us, especially a trained spec writer, that it will happen. It might only happen once or twice a year or once a month, but it does happen.
Well, it's good to be organized. It sounds like you've got that well in hand. So issue number 3, failing to target the office master. This is really quick. We've talked about the Master Guide specifications and how to get into the office master. And Sharice just spoke to the fact that a lot of the time when you're dealing with individual projects, that those things don't always get back. Certainly, if you've got a tool that makes it relatively easy to do that and distribute it, makes it a little bit easier as opposed to tracking all that stuff manually in different Word documents in different locations. So, not going to focus on this too much, just there are a lot of people that work with building product manufacturers, and one of the things that they tell that product rep is not to just focus on the product, is to ask them directly, hey, what's it going to take to get in your firm's office master? Very, very critical to make sure that you're getting an upstream as opposed to just that one particular product. So this one right here, issue number 4. Failing to use a data-driven approach to identifying firms where you can make inroads. This is under the heading of, in case you don't have an unlimited budget. You'll remember a slide from a little earlier. We do have a tool that allows you to sort of analyze how you're doing with these different firms called SpecLive. There's a lot of design firms out there. And I remember a survey from a few years back that said 93% of all commercial construction spending passed through the top 300 design firms. They're obviously not all created equal. Dodge and CMD do a very good job of showing you where you're getting spec'd at the bid stage, but it's somewhat of an after-action report. SpecLive does provide the opportunity to take a look and see how you're doing kind of in process before you get to the bid stage. You can do things like run a report. You can show me every project where one of your 2 competitors is getting specified and your products are not, and use that information to more closely focus your efforts. On the left here, we've got a firm usage report. It shows how many times every single firm is breaking it down, how often you're getting specified. There's some comparisons here in the upper right-hand side, and we've also got summary overviews that kind of show, increases over time in your spec rate. So the next 2 are dealing with manufacturer specs here, and Sharice, this is definitely something that I know creates a lot of headaches for you. You're probably best to walk people through these next 2 issues.
Yeah. Okay. So one of my CSI friends, Casey Robb, I know you're on there, Casey, former CSI president, sent me a message on Facebook this morning and said, be nice to us manufacturers. So Casey, you might want to cover your ears. I will say that, and I may be being conservative, that 95% of the specs that I get from manufacturers are not properly written to standard spec writing procedures. I've had reps come to me and say, oh, here, I have a 3-part spec for you, because they just broke their section into 3 parts, and now they think they have a contractually risk-free spec section for me. And all they've done is put stuff in 3 parts, and most of it's not even in the right place in the 3 parts. If I could ask manufacturers, and I talk to my reps about this all the time, but they have to use what the higher ups tell them they're going to use. And the leadership at the manufacturers are really missing this. They're missing it. They give me a spec. It's 48,000 pages long because it has all this information I don't even really need. It's got things that we can't say in a spec contractually. We're not allowed to dictate means and methods. And they'll have these detailed instructions on how the contractor's got to do their job. And we can't do that. Understanding those things, hiring a CSI certified spec writer to write their specs the right way is one of the that and just being in my master, so I already know it's structured the right way. Those are the two most important things a manufacturer can do. Because I spent 3 days rewriting one spec section once for a project because we had to have that product. But if I get something like that from you and it's a mess, I've had to rewrite every sentence in a spec section because it just doesn't follow any standard principles. And we have a contract. Our specs are part of the contract. I can't stress that enough. Our specs and drawings are a part of the contract. And so they have to say and do certain things. And when I get that, and I have to do that, I don't have hours. My boss is not paying me for hours of work to rewrite your specs. If I get a good, clean spec that follows all the rules, I can get that stuff in there quickly for my project. If I've got to rewrite the whole thing and I've already got something I like in my spec, there is no way I'm going to sit there and spend 2, 4, 10 hours rewriting your spec to use your product. And it's such a simple thing to do. Your company will spend maybe a couple grand or something hiring an independent spec writer to rewrite your specs so they're right. And that will translate in getting used in the very first project that you get used. It's going to pay for it 10 times. So your specs stink. And I'm saying that in the nicest way. I have a crown on and it's all cute. They really stink, and we really need better specs. If that's how you're going to get me specs and not get into the masters, I need them written correctly. I'll stop complaining, bitchy.
Every time we bring this up, Sharice is like, I could spend hours and hours on this. Getting those specs broken up into 3 parts and just making sure they don't have to be completely rewritten. Well, you still end up seeing some specs that actually are written, I would say in a general way. They are written the correct way, but there's some sneaky things that we see sometimes that translate to extra work for the specifier. And one of those is, things that, come across and they look fine, but they're covertly proprietary, and it requires them to sort of be rewritten, for example, so that you can potentially include 2 or 3 other alternatives, which is going to be required on a lot of jobs. And that's kind of the topic of issue number 6, providing specs that meet your needs, not the AE's. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, there's, and you guys can read the bullet points, so I'm not going to read them. And proprietary specs are an issue. There are no equals. I get that. There are no 2 products that are exactly equal, and that's okay. But when you have things written so strictly that it is really clear, at least to a trained spec writer, that no other product can compete. And let's say 2 of my firms I worked at for years and years did only schools, public work, were required to have 3 equivalent products on there's very few exceptions allowed in that scenario. Or if I get this change at the last minute and I don't have time to research it and I miss something that makes that proprietary, the bids could be thrown out on that project. I want to know that up front. Usually what I'll do if I need to put something new in my spec and it's not in my master is I will send that rep my spec because I don't want to rewrite theirs and say, I want you to write up all your components in the same way this product I already have in here is written up. So I have a side-by-side comparison, and I want you to let me know if you have anything different. But one thing that everybody's missing right now is most of a good majority of the trained spec writers are retiring. There's very, very few of us in Gen X that have the year's experience and the spec training and the contract document training. And there's some young people coming in, but they're just getting their feet wet. If you're handing this stuff to a design team, some firms don't even have spec writers. And that design team is not trained in contract documents, and they're just cutting and pasting it in, and then they get their bids thrown out later, or something else bad happens, or they have to deal with extensive change orders during construction because they didn't understand these contract documents and you gave it to them. That doesn't leave you looking very good for that design team. So maybe it truly is proprietary, but we need to know that up front and have it not be buried in the middle of something, because we're often working on deadlines and sometimes changes are happening at the last minute. We don't have the time to do the research.
Yeah, and
we need you to have our backs.
Yeah, the goal is to get used again and again. It's to get in that office master, and even if somehow you're able to sneak it through once, it's probably, as you say, leave a bad taste in their mouths and lead to not using that product in the future. All right, so this is one actually that I felt strongly about including, just because I feel confident there's a few people that are still making this mistake out here. So firms really should be providing BIM content. It's just understanding it's not really going to affect product selection in any meaningful way, which is a surprise to a lot of people. It's not more likely to get you into specification. In fact, I think that this one has kind of been making the rounds for a little while, and I think the secret's probably out at this point. We just don't see as many firms making this mistake anymore. So I'm seeing building product manufacturers who spent a lot of money a few years back and expected to see more return on their investment. At this point, they have a more realistic, to be honest, kind of jaded perspective, and they're looking for kind of a second-gen solution. But I mentioned it here just in case someone, one of the higher ups, has said, make sure your marketing plan includes BIM. And it really doesn't work. Manufacturers that are providing Revit content, BIM content that's too heavy for usage by most architectural and engineering firms. Those firms at that stage of the design process, they favor generic objects. And a good deal of what they may download and contributes to, hey, I'm getting some downloads here. It must be helping the process at some point. Those are going to get stripped down and used for things like collision detection. Those objects are being built at LOD 2 and 3, which is really only for use by the contractors and facilities pros. It's going to crash a lot of those systems. So if there's, I still run into a lot of people that want to find some way to make BIM work, and a lot of the companies that we're working with are a little bit more experienced. They've gone through and tried something, saw that it didn't work, and they're pivoting a little bit. And so a lot of what we're seeing out there, people that are committed to involving BIM in the solution at some level, is they're building configurators. They're building Revit plugins that can help specifiers, or in a lot of cases modelers, put together fairly complex systems, HVAC, suspended ceilings, flooring systems, things like this, things that might span multiple sections. Well, at the end of that process, they're going to have some BIM objects in their self-created kind of plug-in there, and it usually ends, which is just handing a problem to the specifier upstream to understand how to put that all together. We've actually developed an API that allows all those different applications, no matter how they're built, you hit a button and it automatically creates a fully configured spec based on that. So that's about the only way that we're actually seeing people connect the dots on that. And Charisse, throw this open to you here. When I wanted to include something on this slide here, we actually kind of disagreed a little bit because it seemed so out of place, like it just doesn't have anything to do with your process, at least as far as product selection was concerned.
It doesn't. It has no bearing whether a manufacturer has Revit objects or not on whether we choose their product. We're choosing products based on what's best for the building that we're designing. That said, because I agree, whether you have Revit objects or not does not influence the product that we choose, but Revit objects are very valuable to the design team once we choose the product. They come into play after that, and if they're properly done Revit objects that have the right information, that can, especially on some of the more complicated systems, that can help the team save a lot of time in drawing up your system, and also help the team make sure that they're drawing it correctly. But I don't really have much more to say about this except for, there's only a couple of firms around the country that are really tying the model to their specs at this point. And that's one of the reasons I chose SpecLink. Well, we're nowhere near doing it in my firm, and most firms aren't. I chose SpecLink because I know I will be able to at some point when the technology gets to where I needed to be to make that work for us. The bigger firms have a lot more manpower to try crazy new things. Most firms don't have that yet, but I'm poised to do that when the time comes. But those Revit objects don't influence my specs at all, or the team's product selection.
Okay, well, this next one was easy to include because I don't think I've ever talked to a specifier, not had them complain about this item.
Can you tell I picked the picture? It's such a minor thing, and I'm not going to say too much about this because I think we even had buttons at the CSI convention a couple of years ago that had no registration, a big red circle with a line through it. So I'm just going to tell you a super quick story. I was working on a project a few years ago. They wanted to use a new window system that we had, and this was the day before the bid set was supposed to go out. New windows. We all know windows are complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And so I went to the manufacturer's website because I'm stressing. It takes a long time to write a good window section to get their technical information and their guide specs. And it said, you have to register. Okay, I'm already pissed off, people. So I registered, and I get a message back saying, within 72 hours, we'll let you know if we deem you acceptable to be registered. It didn't say, those weren't the words, but that was certainly the vibe. And so like, I need this today. I don't need it in 72 hours. Went to the website, looked for their list of reps. They didn't have one. So I don't have any idea who my local rep is. I searched LinkedIn, couldn't figure it out there. Called the company, got a message machine that said, we'll contact you back within 48 hours. Guess what I did? I specified a different window. That was millions of dollars. That was a high-rise building, and we specified a different window. There, I get that you want to know how to find me and send me information. You've got a list of every firm in the country. You do not need me to register your website, and you're not protecting your information. Your competition had it before you put it out publicly, trust me. I need to be able to get to good technical content within 2 clicks of coming to your site. I can't stress that enough. I wish I could get the president of every manufacturer. I would love to have a meeting with the president of every manufacturer in the country. Let me tell you how you can sell your product to me. Because right now, in some areas, you're missing the boat, and that's a big one. Was that clear enough?
Oh, yeah.
Clear?
I think, you know, there's a lot of different things that you can do to kind of slow down that adoption curve. As far as aggravation potential, this has got to be number one. It just seems to be almost universal.
If I don't absolutely have to have it, I just go elsewhere if I've got to deal with that.
Certainly. So we're going to step through the last few items here really quick because we want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So I'll be relatively brief. I really like working with newer products, things that are you know, have the potential to change the way the industry works and so forth. And so it's one of the things that I've tried to find ways to help people that are not just providing another product in kind of an established category. And so this is one that you know, I've spent a lot of time with. And it's different. If you've got a product that is brand new and it may be something that doesn't even fit nicely in a section, or it may have a section, but it's doesn't really have any equivalent out there, your approach at the early stages is probably going to be a little bit different than the later stages. And it might not always be a good candidate. I've spent half the presentation sort of telling you to get into that Master Guide specification. I'm here to tell you that there are some products that are out there that you may approach both Master Guide specification providers, and they may not be able to put it in there for a variety of reasons. But there are other ways to sort of get around that issue. It's really important to have high quality guide specs, which is something that they can both provide for you. You got to focus more on targeting owners and designers. And very critically, don't underestimate the amount of work involved that once somebody picks that, that's involved in rewriting a project to incorporate it. They're probably not going to use a proprietary section in its entirety. We have some tools that can actually help overcome that a little bit. And then, you know, once you've gone through and gotten a little bit established, the rules for getting into that early majority are a little bit different. They're more likely to want to see case studies, and Sharice alluded to this a little bit earlier, hopefully showing how it performs over time. Whether there's a equivalent or not, it's probably going to be helpful to have some competitors. Sharice, would you have kind of done a lot to set that one up? I'm not sure what else you'd like to add to that, but there does seem to be a difference.
You know, the more information we can get, you know, sometimes depending on, again, on what it is, I will ask, where is this installed locally that I can go look at it? For instance, Portland, we have a lot of rain in Portland. So if it's something that is I had this happen recently, something that is highly affected by water. And I asked, do you have it installed anywhere? Well, we have it installed in Arizona. Okay, even if I wanted to fly over there and look at it, that's going to mean nothing to me because they don't have the issues with water and moisture in Arizona that we have in Oregon. So I might ask to see where it's installed and how long it's been installed. Do you have anything installed that's been in for at least 5 years? And I understand that puts manufacturers between a rock and a hard place. I mean, if nobody will specify it, how do we get it installed somewhere for a while to get you to consider it? But it depends on what it is. But maybe testing results are a good one. Have you had it tested, ASTM or whatever, that I can lay that side by side with what we're using and compare those test results? That's a big deal if you don't have a long-term history with the product. So those are good things to consider when you're approaching somebody on what kinds of things we're going to want to see to be an innovator and early adopter of a new product.
Yeah, that's something. If you talk to one of our reps, we can kind of walk you through, the approach being a little different. Taking an early adopter approach or an innovator approach and trying to use that to convince people in the early majority here isn't going to be successful. But we can kind of help you overcome some of those and treat those products a little bit differently and help you move from one to the other relatively quickly. So this is one that I asked to include, and it's one that we see a lot. A lot of time, hey, you've got a product, it's already in the spec, and it doesn't do you any good. You've got sort of a big tent methodology that says these are the requirements for a particular product type. Your product meets those minimal requirements and then some. And it doesn't do you a lot of good because they're sort of represented as equivalents, and so you're getting beat on price down the road. There are some ways of solving that. Charisse, you want to speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, well, I don't know that there are some ways to solve that, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of reasons that we specify one product and another one eventually gets used. And that's what my little pictures are. Bids came in too high, or there's scope creep on the project, and now we're way over budget, and we have to pick areas where we have to scale back. In one of the previous slides, I had a note about good, better, best. Sometimes we will specify what we want. It's a higher quality item, and then down the road during construction, things happen and the contractor requests a substitute material that's not the one we wanted in the first place, but because there's problems with budgets or time or whatever, that the owner will decide, okay, I'm going to take this because maybe it's not best, but it's better, and I can save this much money by using this, and I need to get my budget down because something else went over. There's so many different things that happen. Another thing that happens is early in design, schematic design or design development, we issue a narrative or an outline spec, and we don't know much about the design at that time. So we pick some products we typically use, and maybe a rep gets wind of that. And, oh, they're going to use our product on this project. Really, at that point, we're throwing stuff in there that we know something about, but we don't know enough about the design at that really super early phase to know whether that specific product is the one we're going to use. And then as we develop the design, we may choose something else. So I think the more important thing about this is just truly understanding from project conception to demolition, how design decisions come down in a firm and when they come down and why they come down. Because I think that would really help the manufacturer's reps know where to go when, and every project's different. Yeah. Let's make it easier. Every project's different.
Yeah, and that certainly makes sense. There's a couple of things that we've always been able to do. One is obviously, you write a more proprietary guide spec that calls out those particular characteristics and maybe narrows the list of alternative manufacturers that can provide those. We actually have something within SpecLink itself, within the content, that allows you to have sort of a generic product type and then a more tightly written basis of design product type in close proximity. And if it's appropriate, you can turn on the language for one and not the other. And it makes it so you don't have to rewrite it. And if your product rep has made the case that it's worth spending a little bit more for something that's longer lasting, they can turn it on right there. So,
and I love that, by the way. I have to say that is my perfect world, that we go make a change at any point in the process, and I can just go turn this off and turn this on. That's my perfect world.
Good deal.
I love it.
Sharice, I'm going to get out of your way and let you take us through the last couple slides. I think we're running a little bit long. So do you want to go ahead and speak to this one, and then we'll
this one's quick. Yeah, this one's quick and basic, and everybody's talked about it. But I've heard complaints or grousing about, you know, I can't get in to see you. Please understand that we have thousands of products on a building, and I get contacted by hundreds of manufacturers reps a year. And some of those are more the marketing sales pitches for lunch and learns or whatever. Those are great. We need those at the outset. But if I've already worked with you a lot, I have some reps that they'll call me up and say, can I have 15 minutes? I'm bringing you in this technical information, and bam, we just get it done. Just understand that our time is billable. And most of us, I'm very fortunate to work for a company that gives me more freedom, but most of us have, in a lot of firms, a certain percentage of your time that has to be billable. And that time spent on things like masters and working with reps and stuff is not billable time. So we have to be very selective about when and what and the importance of something in the moment. And as much as I know everybody hates the whole lunch and learn concept, they are really valuable because that is the one, that's not part of our workday. We're giving up that time to come to your lunch and learn. But it's not interfering with our billable time quotas if we have them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So rather than have you read the takeaways here, which are up on the screen here, I wanted to see how much time we could devote to questions. So Sarah, do you have anything kind of queued up, and we'll see how many of these we can potentially get through?
Hey Matt, yeah. You're going to have to give me one takeaway. Oh,
please, let's hear it.
Okay. So you guys can all read. I'm assuming you're going to provide these slides to the attendees if they want them.
Yep.
Okay. So the very last one. Obviously, I'm heavily involved with CSI. I'm also on the Institute board. Mm-hmm. If I was Queen of the World, which Paul from BSD said I could wear my crown today, so for this few minutes I get to be Queen of the World. Every single person that works in this industry, not just manufacturers and their reps, and I'm talking from the boss down, would be required to get project delivery education. At the very least, their CDT certification. When a rep walks in to talk to me and they hand me their business card, the first thing I look for is, do they have CSI and CDT after their name? Because I know immediately that they can speak my language and we can get down to business. If they don't have it, they have to get a CSI lecture from me before we even talk about their product. But having that knowledge, I know you know how my life happens and how my work comes down and what's important and what isn't, and we can really get things done. So I expect every manufacturer on this call to be CSI or CDT certified by next year, and just send me an email and let me know when you do it.
I know how important that is to you. I was wondering whether we were going to get through this presentation without
nope.
that point. That's important stuff, certainly.
Okay, you can go now, Sarah. I'm done preaching.
Well, thank you both. We have about 2 minutes here, so super fast lightning round. One of the questions that came through, actually it came through a few times, how does the BPM rep establish and build a quality relationship with the specifier? And how should that BPM rep then approach a specifier? Is it better through email? Is it better through phone? Is it better through conferences and meetups?
All of the above. Part of that depends on the specifier. Like, I hate the telephone. I do. I really hate the telephone. I would prefer to be emailed and then call you when I need something and interact that way. But there are other specifiers that would rather talk on the phone, but phone calls are an interruption where you can deal with emails at a time you have blocked out to do that. I love meeting new reps at conferences because it's free from work. And you have more flexibility to sit down and have a conversation and not worry about that deadline going out at 3 o'clock. I've made friends with, I don't know, I must have had 5 or 6 connection requests on LinkedIn just this morning from product reps. And I connect that way, and I'm happy to interact. I don't appreciate getting a sales email the second I connect with you. Know who I am and know what my firm does. I gave Matt an example when we chatted about a rep kind of rather aggressively wanting to come see me, and they dealt in products that were typically used in super high-end residential or hotels, things like that. And I worked in a firm that did nothing but schools. The likelihood I was going to specify any of this particular rep's products was 0 to none. So not only was he wasting his time, but he was wasting mine because we just didn't do that type of project or use those kind of products in a school where kids beat the hell out of everything they touch. So, you know, do a little research. There's all kinds of information about me on LinkedIn. Know who I'm working for, what products I deal in. You know, I'm doing the building enclosure now, so I'm not going to spend time with a tile rep probably at this particular juncture because I don't specify tile anymore, hardly ever. But I know how to find you if I need it. So just be considerate of the time. Make sure you know who you're talking to, and that's more beneficial to you because you don't want to waste time on me if I can't use your product, nor should you. And be friendly. Nobody wants the used car salesman anymore. I want a trusted advisor. I know Casey's waiting for me to use those 2 words. I want you to tell me, I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. I want you to offer to look at my specs and help me find the holes, not only in your stuff, but in my competitors, and help me make it a solid spec. I want to be your friend and have a collaborative equal seats at the table relationship. That's how you build a relationship with me.
Thank you. That's a fantastic answer. Another one that came through, and this will unfortunately be the last question since we are out of time, but just to let everybody know, we will be sending out an email tomorrow that will have the link to the recording of the webinar, and it will also have our contact information. So if you did have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be sure we get those questions answered for you. The last question of the day, and we received this from a few people, how is the role of a spec writer changing, not only with COVID-19, but just overall? How are we seeing that shift in the industry?
The biggest issue right now for spec writers is, number one, there's never been a lot of spec writers, because most spec writers, I'm not one of them, but most spec writers started out their life in this world as an architect. And, you know, they did all their young professional stuff, and then they started doing CA, and then they kind of got tired of dealing with all of that, and somebody had a knack for it and said, I want to be a spec writer, and took that role in the firm. And that's typically later in their career, and they get involved in CSI, learn a bunch of stuff, and they become a spec writer. Well, CSI is about more than specs now, but the problem is that our older generation Gen X is so small that the issue we're having right now is a lack of spec writers. So I think the challenge for manufacturers is, in some of the spec writers in firms are spec writers by title, but not necessarily by training. They were in the firm and somebody said, okay, now you're writing specs, that's your new title. It doesn't mean that they know what they're doing. And manufacturers have a really unique opportunity. You're dealing with a lot of younger people right now that are really bright, and they're not resistant to change. I tell manufacturers all the time, those of you that are only asking to talk to the firm principals and you're ignoring the younger professionals in the office are making the biggest mistake of your life, because a good half of the millennials have to step up into a more advanced role 10 to 20 years earlier than they ever had to before, because there's not enough Gen Xers to fill the boomers' shoes. And they're not afraid of change. Boomers and some Gen Xers were raised to be more resistant to change. The more you know what you're doing with those documents, the more you help protect us, and we probably need it more than ever now, because there are so few of us out there. And most of the trained spec writers have gone as independents because they're making a fortune as independents because there's no spec writers. So being able to help us, and you're talking to a designer and you go, oh, well, you don't want to say that in your spec, and here's why. It's this kind of risk. And you know something they don't, oh my God, you're golden. So again, back to getting project delivery training and really becoming that trusted advisor, and not ignoring the younger professionals in the office, because they are already making decisions because there's not enough Gen Xers to do it. They're handing them things they never would have done at that age before. You need to not be ignoring that group, because they are truly, in a big way, your future, because they are not afraid to try something new. Where some of us might be a little bit more resistant, you show them the right stuff, and they'll take a chance where we might not have. So that's how the role is changing drastically right now. I'm one specifier for 9 offices in a company with 350 people in 2 countries. They're not easy to find. I'm the golden goose, so that's pretty awesome. But
fantastic answer. Charisse, Matt, I wanted to take a moment just to thank you both for taking the time today to share this information with our attendees. And to our attendees, thank you for taking the time out of your day today to join us and learn a little bit more about how to overcome the new product adoption curve